Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 2, Part 6, Alexisdorf and Wetmarsh, read by Natalia Buzova. The war started by Nazi Germany was entering its final phase. The Allies, fearing that the Soviet Union would seize half of Europe without their help, finally opened a second front. Our troops were approaching Hitler's lair from the east, and no force could stop them. Sensing that the end was coming, the Nazis began to cover their bloody crimes. They disguised ditches with mountains of corpses, dismantled places of mass killing, and took prisoners of war to the far reaches of the Reich. In the autumn of 1944, we were last loaded into wagons and taken north from Dortmund. We found ourselves almost near Holland. There, among the swamps and meadows, there were two large camps, Alexisdorf and Wetmarsh. Soviet prisoners of war who became disabled were brought there from all over. Among us were armless and legless, mutilated by bullets and shrapnel, German butts and police sticks. About 20,000. Some of us had tuberculosis. There were no doctors except for those who were invalids themselves. I first got to Alexisdorf, and a month later I was transferred to Wetmarsh. Why, I don't know. There was no difference between them. The names of those camps obviously came from the settlements of the same names, which were somewhere nearby, but we didn't see them. Only wires and watchtowers could be seen around. The guards consisted entirely of Germans. They were also attached to blocks and barracks. The police service was no longer among the prisoners. Former brutal police officers of 1941-42 were scattered in camps and work teams where they disguised themselves as ordinary prisoners. But if any of them were recognized, they were killed or strangled on the first night and then thrown into toilet pits. About 200 people lived in each barrack. There was an elder in the barracks. At his disposal was a group of paramedics who cleaned the barracks and worked in the kitchen. They brought gruel. The dead were taken away and some work was done in the yard. The heads of the block stood above the barrack elders, and the camp superiors consisted of Germans. I later learned that there was a strong underground organization in the camp. In each block were its cells, headed by former commanders of the Red Army. The underground were the de facto masters of the blocks and barracks. In conversations, they supported us morally. They instilled faith in the speedy liberation and return to the homeland. The camp underground was headed by an elderly sailor, and in our barrack by Kuzma Bezruki. I don't know his last name. That's what everyone called him because he didn't have one hand. The order in the barracks was normal. The Germans hardly interfered in our affairs, and their superiors were responsive and fair. Conflict situations were resolved collectively, and the perpetrators were punished by the general condemnation or transfer to another barrack. It was forbidden to play cards, and no one lost the last ration of bread, as in Slavuta. But the food was the same as before. The Germans obviously had nothing to eat themselves, not to mention thinking about us. I began to look for some auxiliary activity to satisfy my hunger with an extra piece of bread at least once in a while. My shoemaking tool remained in Volodymyr-Volynsk, and there was no work for shoemakers there, because almost all of us, except for the paramedics, moved in wooden shoes. I began to look closely at a man who made beautiful baskets of straw and took a loaf of bread for each. 2 or 3 days, and the basket was ready. And those prisoners who were taken somewhere to work took them away from him. They managed to sell the Germans more expensively, as well as get a sheaf of straw, thin and flexible wire, as well as some dies. I was sitting next to him for hours and watching everything he did. And at the end of the day, I took the remnants of straw which he had thrown away as unusable, and I tried to weave harnesses to the basket. When I felt that it was coming out, I asked one of the workers, Alexei Yelkin, a native of the Kirov region, to bring me a sheaf of straw, and I would weave the same baskets for him. One day, he brought me straw and fine wire, and the dyes were a German green overcoat, a ballpoint pen, and a red strapped aside, which I bought, a few pills. So I have three colors, blue, red, and green of green cabbage leaves. 7, 8 baskets could come out of a good sheaf of straw threshed with a chain. 3 or 4 pieces were cut from each stalk, from knee to knee, and sorted into individual bundles according to their thickness. Those beams were then painted in hot water, after which they sparkled beautifully. The process of making a basket was as follows. First, you needed to sew a box of cardboard, approximate length 25-30 centimeters, width 15, height up to 10 centimeters. Then you pasted it on the inside with a beautiful silk, velvet, or cloth. Then you weaved a plate about 3 meters long and 2.5 centimeters in diameter. The harness was like a rope. It was woven from 4 straws, blue, red, green, and white, which had to be wet so as not to crack. The core of the harness was a wire which was also strung with a straw. The plait would be cast in 4 colors that seemed to wrap it in a spiral. Next, you covered the bottom and top of the box as well as the lid. And then you made windows out of darts and straws, only 6, and on the lid, pyramids and a handle, as well as a lock on the side. The basket was ready. It attracted the eye, intrigued. How such a miracle was done? It could store women's perfumes, buttons, needles, threads, and candy. But it would survive 2 or 3 years and fade. It would lose its original beauty. Most of my baskets were sold at large by Alexei Yelkin. There he was given a loaf or 2 of bread and a bag of potatoes for it, and he always brought me bread. I managed to sell 1 basket to a German guarding the camp. I approached the wire fence, pointing and speaking in German. I have a beautiful basket. And what do you want for it? He asked. 1 loaf of bread, I said. Throw it, I'll see. I must say that the Germans in such trade relations with us were honest, not deceived. And I wrapped the basket in a clean cloth and threw it over the wires. The German looked at it and promised to bring the payment the next day at the same time. The next day, he was on duty again, throwing me a loaf of bread and a roll of sausage sandwiches. So, at the end of the war, the Germans became different, no longer firing from the towers and trading with us instead. I came to the barrack, ate the sandwiches, drank tea, and put the bread in a bag under my head and fell fast asleep with a full stomach. So my business got better. I did not go hungry and sometimes gave bread to my compatriot from the village of Luka, Peter Kapinus, who was very thin and coughed. After the war, he returned home with a stick in his hand and tuberculosis in his lungs, lived 2 or 3 years and died. The trade in the freedom through the work teams and the Germans who guarded them was in full swing. The contingent of the disabled was constant. It gradually became overgrown with all sorts of tools with which strange things were made. Wooden boxes decorated with patterns of copper, bronze, aluminum, or simply carved with a knife. Straw baskets, cigarette cases, cradles, multicolored photo frames, rings, shoemakers sewed beautiful slippers with flowers from the cloth. and all that was exchanged for bread and potatoes. And there at large may have been sold for lard, eggs, even for Deutsche Mark. Somewhere near us there was the sea, followed by England. On quiet, sunny evenings, we watched the Germans launch their FAU-1 and FAU-2 missiles there. They left behind traces of fire. And in response, almost every day, starting at 10 a.m., huge armadas of Anglo-American bombers flew from the British Isles into the depths of Germany. There were so many of them that it was impossible to count them, and they flew for an hour across the visible sky. Small fighters circled between them. No one fired anti-aircraft fire at them, and none of the German aviators pursued them. It was simply impossible. We followed them with envious glances and said, they are flying to visit Hitler. Allied aviation systematically destroyed the industrial potential of the Nazi Reich. Hitler's Germany died. Its human, military, and material reserves were exhausted. There were not enough soldiers at the front, and there were not enough workers in the rear. The Germans forced prisoners of war to work, as well as young people forcibly deported from the occupied countries. But those categories of workers resorted to sabotage, damaging the machines and the products themselves. In our camp, there were more and more commissions to select laborers for mines and factories, as well as for the countryside for families who lost their breadwinners at the front. The mines were afraid of. Weakened and sick prisoners were sometimes brought to us from there. Some injured themselves in this way. They put hot potatoes on the body. It burnt human flesh. And the decay of the wound began, which did not heal for a long time. Doctors could not determine what kind of disease it was, and they wrote off such prisoners to the camp. But they went to agricultural work willingly, because there the owners fed well so that the prisoners could work at full strength. But only disabled people with minor healed bone injuries were taken there. I went to the next commission without a stick, and I was included in the agricultural team. It was the end of February 1945.